In Joshua chapter 15, there's a word that comes up again and again and again and again. It's, I think, the most frequently used word in at least the first 12 verses of the chapter, and it's the word boundaries. They're dividing up the land as the inheritance for each of the different tribes, and it's laying out where all the different boundaries are. And this was the northern boundary, and this was the southern boundary, and the east and the west, and boundary of the water, and the boundary of the mountains, and boundary, just reminding us that our God is a God of boundaries. And it's good for us that he is, in at least two ways that I can think of right now. One, he establishes boundaries on the temptations that hit us. You know, Scripture says that no temptation has seized you except what's common to everybody else. And God is faithful. When you are tempted, he'll always provide a way out so that you can stand up underneath it. He puts boundaries around the temptations that Satan can throw in your direction. The temptation is never too strong for you. It's not. You have the right to believe that because Scripture promises that. God sets boundaries on what Satan is allowed to do to you. God also sets boundaries in another way. He sets boundaries on the hardship of life. To say it another way, he knows what our hearts can take. And he knows that our hearts can only take so much. You know, just listen to the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 4, where he's talking about how we are jars of clay. We are so fragile. We are so breakable. And that shows up in so many different ways, usually in the pressure points of life. And he says, he was a lot of things. It says he was hard pressed and perplexed and persecuted and struck down, but he has phrases in between each of those. He says, you know, we're hard pressed, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but we're not in despair. We're persecuted, but we're not abandoned. We're struck down, but we're not destroyed. There was a boundary to what all of those hardships could do to the Apostle Paul. And the boundary always kept him going. God never allowed so much to happen that it crushed him. Just read those verses in a different way if you just take the second phrase of each of those, where it says, we're not crushed. We're not in despair. We're not abandoned. And we're not destroyed. If you're watching a video on your phone or some other device right now, you can say the same thing. You have not been crushed. You haven't given up hope. Hopefully we're giving you hope. So you're not in despair. You're not abandoned. At the very least, we're here together, but God is here with you too. And you're not destroyed. You're not. And why? Because God puts boundaries around our lives. He knows what our hearts can take. He allows us to go through things that stretch us, and that trouble us, and that weigh us down. Always to love us, always to strengthen our faith and to increase our longing for God. And he knows that often that's the only way that happens in life. That we have to go through something hard in order to cry out to God with a little bit more passion. But that's an act of love. He just wants us to be close to him. And why? Well, I want you to imagine that you are someone who has fallen into temptation, who didn't appreciate the boundaries that God set, or didn't believe that they were there, and you just gave in. I want you to think of a time that you maybe did that. You gave in to the temptation. Or I want you to imagine that you're somebody who has fallen into deep despair. Someone who feels completely crushed. Maybe you have even given up on God. Yelled at him, challenged him, doubted him, walked away from him. Even if that's you, and I bet at one time or another it has been. It's the case for all of us. Just remember, there's no boundary on God's grace. There's no boundary on God's love for you. That's what Jesus showed us. There were no boundaries on the lengths to which he was willing to go to be there for you. No boundaries on God's grace. No boundaries on his love. But boundaries in the places where we need them from a God who will always love you. Rest well tonight, my friends.